This is Easy Oil Painting by Estelle Day. I've been following her on Instagram for a while, and I noticed that she has a book available. In the beginning, she covers all the materials and how she prepares her panels, but there's a series of projects in here starting in chapter 4. So here are some ideas for some still life paintings. The beginning projects are simpler, like this painting of an egg, and they get more advanced as you progress. I thought I would do the one of a silver pitcher, and if you're not any good at drawing, you could just trace this image here because it's 4 by 4 inches. And she has instructions on how you could transfer that drawing to a panel. So her panels are 4 by 4 inches, but I feel like I should make it bigger so it's easier to film. That way you can see what I'm doing. She likes to use linen, that's why this has like that beige color to it, but you could use regular prime canvas if you want to. So I thought I'll use an ampersand Gessobord for this painting demo, but I only have 8 by 10, so I'm wondering, should I order up 8 by 8 panels and wait for those to come in? I don't think so. I cut that down to 8 inches, and I think I'm going to tone this board. If you're wondering what the benefits are, I made a video about that. You can watch that next if you're interested in learning more about it. So I'll just take some Liquitex gesso, squirt some out onto this paper palette. I find that it's easier to use these inks to tint gesso because they're already thinned out. You don't have to work out any lumps, so that works pretty well. This kit has 6 colors, and it does include black. It is a good idea to shake them because the pigment can settle. So I'll just put a drop, maybe 2 drops in there and see how dark that is. These are Liquitex acrylic inks, which are compatible with acrylics. I'll put 2 more in. I wouldn't use regular inks, but you can use other acrylics such as heavy body or soft body acrylics. If you wanted, you could put color in there or a brownish color. I think I'll just stick with the gray, that'll be easy to do. Then you just brush it on and let it dry. I dry that off with a hair dryer. Now it's time to do a drawing. I'm going to draw directly onto the panel, but if you want to trace her drawing, you can do that. And she has a set of instructions here on how to transfer the drawing to your canvas panel. I scanned the photograph from the book so that I can compare it side by side with my painting. Plus it's easier to have it flat rather than having a book propped open. You also notice that I added a grid to both the panel and the photo. She doesn't do this in the book, but sometimes I do this because it makes the drawing easier. I could do a whole video on this, but it basically gives you a reference point that you can use to determine where the placement of each shape should be. I'll just get started and you'll see what I'm talking about. So you see that this edge of the picture is not quite halfway in this quadrant right here. So I'll just put some marks on here. I could just look at this and figure out where these things land on the painting. I should mention that this is a 2H pencil, which has a lighter line, but it's less likely to smear. So I'll probably brush on some clear gesso. She recommends that in her book, and you'll see what that looks like later. But if we were to use like a denser graphite like 6B, it would smear a lot more, and sometimes that's a problem. I also like using pencil extenders because you can use these little short stubby pencils right down to the end, and it still feels pretty comfortable in your hand. I think that looks pretty good, so I'll erase some of these lines, especially the grid. This is just a kneaded eraser, and they call it a kneaded eraser because you can knead it into different shapes. And when it gets dirty, you can also knead it a little bit more to expose clean areas. So you can pinch it to get into fine areas to erase lines. What I like about these Faber-Castell kneaded erasers is they have this plastic case, and I store them in there. They seem to last a lot longer. If you leave them outside of the case for a long time, they start to dry out. It looks like she uses a Conti crayon, and you would have to fix that with the fixative so it doesn't smear when you paint over it. This is graphite. It should be fine the way it is, but I also noticed she uses clear gesso, and I thought I would give that a try. I have a bottle of this. It looks different now because they got a newer label, but I'll put some on top just to see how it works. So the clear gesso had a chance to dry, and it has a nice and gritty texture to it, but it still allows the pencil drawing to show through, so it won't smear. That comes in handy if you need to wipe away an area and start over. In the demo, she uses regular oil paints, but I bought all these different kits of water-soluble oil paints. They're the same as regular oil paints. It's linseed oil and pigment. The difference is there's an extra ingredient that allows you to dissolve the paint with water. So that way you can wash your brushes out with water, and you can also dilute the paint with water. Which paint should I use? I'll pick one of these brands at random. So there's Cobra, Lucas, Grumbacher, and Windsor, and Newton. I'll click randomize, and whatever ends up at the top will be the one I go with. So it looks like it's the Windsor Newton kit. This is the Windsor and Newton Artisan Water Mixable Oil Kit. So let's open this up. So this shows all the different stuff that you can find on the tube, the different mediums you can add to it. Here's some tips on thinning it with water or thinning it with thinner, different mediums. varnishing your paintings, and a recommended basic palette for color mixing. There's 10 colors. There's lemon yellow, cadmium yellow hue, cadmium red hue, permanent alizarin crimson, cerulean blue hue, French ultramarine, phthalo green, yellow ochre, burnt sienna, and titanium white. This is my glass cutting board palette. I made a whole video on this. I keep it inside my Masterson Stay Wet palette. Even though these are oils, it does help to keep them within a container, and I like mixing oils on glass. So I'll just squeeze these colors out and I'll get started. Sometimes you'll notice there's some oil that separates from the paint, and it's good to mix that back in there because that's the binder. I already have the drawing complete. So the second step is to take note of the highlights. The brightest highlights are the highlights along the rim and the handle, the underside of the spout, and then along the left bottom corner. And the third step is to look for the darkest darks. The darkest spots are the opening up here with the spout, and there's a dark shadow area underneath the picture. So step 4 is to start mixing the colors, and notice that she tests the paint color out on a piece of paper. That's how I do my color mixing videos, and this is something that artists have been doing for a long time. You mix the color and then you can compare it to the object you're trying to paint. She also points out that these colors in the picture aren't simply just a gray, there's color mixed in there. These are some of the colors she recommends that you use, but you could use whatever colors you have on hand. I'm using this set from Winsor & Newton. So I'll start mixing some of these colors, and then I'll follow through in what she has here. She starts with the shadows, and then she puts the colors into the reflections. So I'll get started with mixing the colors. I don't think my printout is totally accurate, so I'll be looking at the book too. This is ultramarine blue and burnt umber. You can mix a color that's pretty close to being black. So I'll start with that, and then I'll add some white to it to make some grays. I added more burnt umber to this because it just looked too bluish. I'll add some white to this to see if it's a gray. It's not too bad. It'll probably work for some of these colors. I do think that some of them are more bluish, so I'll mix up one that's a little bit cooler. So that's too blue. It needs like a alizarin crimson or a magenta to make that more of like a purplish color. You can see that's getting closer. That's not too bad. I think maybe a little bit more blue, but that's a close approximation to that color right there. And then I'll mix a darker version of that color. Let's see, some more ultramarine and burnt umber. This color needs a little bit more alizarin in there to make it more purple. It's not bad for the bottom part here. I think this section has more alizarin in there. So maybe I'll split this up into 2 piles and add some more alizarin in the bottom one. It's not too bad for like that section right there. There's warmer colors in the middle here, and that's pretty much a reflection of her face. I think she exaggerated that a little bit in the painting, so I'll mix that color next. I think some lemon yellow and some of the cadmium red would work. Add some white to that. In the photo, it's pretty light and it's neutralized quite a bit, so I could probably add some of this purple in there. So that's a pretty good starting point. I like this green background, and I'll mix that up next. So I'll put it off over to the side, and maybe I'll use some of the cerulean blue. I think there's more yellow in this, and it looks like she added white because it's more of like a pastel color. That might be too much. This isn't bad. It's more saturated. I mean, I could add red to this to make it duller, and maybe a touch of blue. So I'm looking at that, and it needs more blue and maybe more white. I think it's duller, so I could add more red to it. It's not bad. I think some more white. I would say you could just use whatever green that you want. I'm just showing you how you could mix the color that she has if you want it. Some more white, more red would probably do this. Touch more blue and some more white. It's not too bad. I think that's pretty close. It's hard to match it with the texture, but that's a good starting point. Step 5 is to paint the cast shadow. She used raw umber, but I think I have burnt umber, and I'll paint that in there. Step 6 is to put the darkest areas in, and she used a mix of cobalt blue and burnt umber. I don't have cobalt blue. I'll use ultramarine blue. It should work pretty much the same way. And I like how she points out that many artists don't use black straight from the tube. They mix their own blacks, and I totally agree with that because a lot of the areas you think of as being black or gray actually have color in there, and it helps to mix those from actual colors. There's a section in here about the fat over lean principle, which basically means that the first layers of the paint should be thinner and contain less oil. And then as you progress through the painting and add more layers, those additional layers should have more oil in it. That way, the first layers closest to the panel will dry faster, and then the layers on top will dry slower. What that means is that it shouldn't crack as it dries. And the way that you accomplish that with water mixable oils is that you add a little bit of water to your paint to thin them out. So the first layer is thin and has less oil in it. This is burnt umber, and as I just mentioned, I'll add some water to it so that it's a little bit thinner. Maybe I'll add some of this mixture of the burnt umber and the French ultramarine just to make it darker. I noticed that she comes back in and makes this cooler, like if you look at the last page. it's not brownish. So it does get more blue as she finishes the painting. So I'm not gonna worry too much about getting this totally accurate in the beginning. And the shadow does extend all the way underneath this picture. I'll add in the darkest areas, which are on the handle and at the opening here. There are dark shadows along the underside of this handle. When I'm not using my brushes, I just rest them on the side like this so they don't have to clean them out. I use multiple brushes. So now for the fun part, I get to build up the darker shapes within this reflection. And she says, don't bother with like the small details for now. You just go for the most obvious shapes and try to get the overall color as close as possible. When you get more colors down, you can then determine if they're accurate or not and come back and fix them. One issue with water mixable oils is when you do add water to them, it does lighten it slightly. Once the water evaporates, it'll go back to the normal color. In this stage, it doesn't really matter that much because I'll be coming back and fixing it anyway, so I wouldn't really worry about it. I'll start with this big shape on the side and I'll just block in the color. It gets more bluish towards the bottom and I think it does get a little bit lighter, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. Just getting the basic color in there. A little bit of water does make these paints flow more smoothly. It's very easy to brush it on. One thing I like to remind myself of is to paint up to the edge of the pencil line or maybe a little bit beyond it, because if you don't do that and you paint the shape next to it, you might have a white gap between these shapes. Then you have to go back in and fill that in. Another thing to point out is this section here is pretty much dry to the touch. So that makes it easier to layer because you're not painting wet on top of wet. Once this is dry, it's so much easier to paint on top of. This top section gets a little bit more blue, so I added some cerulean blue to it. I see it at the bottom too. I like to turn the painting around just to make it easier to get to different edges. This right side is pretty dark, so I'll just put that in there almost as like a solid color. Step 8 is to build up more color in the reflected areas. So I'll go and I'll put in some of these highlight areas and some of the colors. I'll put in this highlight color, which is mostly this purple with some white added to it. I think I'll work on this bottom section next. It's like an off-white color. I'll put that in there and go from there. I think what I can do is take some of this skin color and add some white to it. I think it needs a little bit more yellow. Step number 9 is to add more detail and to develop the reflected shapes. You could develop the reflected shapes, adjust the values, and look at the smaller details. I'm putting in the green reflection of this background. I also noticed this edge on this dark shape is softer, so I'm trying to soften that up. I'm noticing more details in the stripes in the middle. I have to put that in here, so I'll do that next. Step number 10 is to paint the opening, and she's pointing out that while this is dark, it's not as dark as the spout, so you want to make that a little bit lighter. Step 11 is to work on the handle, and this should be easier because you can use the colors that you mixed up from the previous steps. Step 12 is to work on the background. She used permanent green light, yellow ochre, and titanium white to mix that color. I added some ultramarine blue to it. I think mine was too green. Step 13 is to work on the foreground, which is pretty much this color, but a little bit lighter. I think I'll soften this edge a little bit so it's not so sharp. Step 14 is to refine the cast shadow. The rest of the steps are basically refinements. You put some more details in the reflections, and then she noticed there's some scratches on the picture, and you could take some time to put in some sparkly highlights. I thought the background color was a little bit too thin, so I applied a second coat to it. So here's the final painting. I added some more details to it. I highly recommend this book. You should pick it up and give it a shot. Up next, you want to watch my video on the 5 benefits of toning a canvas.